The Bible has had an unparalleled impact on history, culture, and faith across the globe. It's packed with timeless wisdom, deep mysteries, and profound truths. And no matter how many times you read it, you're always going to learn something new, which is why today I'm going to cover 3 facts about the Bible that you need to know. So here's an interesting fact for you. Did you know that the Bible is the best-selling book of all time? Well, now you know. It's estimated that over 5 billion copies have been sold. And to put this in perspective, this is more than every single Harry Potter, Dr. Seuss, and Lord of the Rings book ever sold combined. And the other interesting thing about this is that Christ himself prophesied this in Matthew 24:14. When talking about what to expect in the end times, Christ says this, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." Most people will interpret this to mean that the gospel message of Christ will be spread to the entire world before the end of days. And what do you know? We're pretty much there, with the exception of just a few places, of course. And the gospel message has spread despite the fact that many people have tried to destroy the biblical texts throughout history. More on that later, but for now, let's go ahead and move on to the second fact. So imagine this. You open up the book of Genesis to try to find the story of Jacob being sold into slavery. It's a big book, but you know it's in chapter 37. So you open up your Bible to the book of Genesis only to see that there are no chapters or verses anywhere. That would make the story kind of tough to find, wouldn't it? Well, it's actually very similar to how the original manuscripts were read. Sort of. Technically, the Old Testament was organized into paragraphs called parashas with some sort of organizational structure, but it wasn't anything like what we have today. In fact, there were no chapters or verses in the original biblical text. Certainly not as we know it today. Over thousands of years, as civilization and literacy developed from oral tradition, people figured out it was much easier to organize the biblical writings by adding chapters and verses to key sections of the text. Although this was a very long and progressive process that lasted hundreds of years, Stephen Langton is the one who is credited to have organized the Bible into the chapters we are most familiar with today. And he did this back in the 13th century. And it wasn't until a few hundred years later that verses were added into those chapters by Robert Etienne in the 16th century. Over time, thanks to these guys and others like them, we're now able to cite the text much easier by memory. Now this takes us to the final fact of the Bible that I'm going to be covering in this video, but before I say it, make sure to leave a comment down below about any other Bible facts that I forgot to mention, and consider clicking the like and subscribe buttons to this video so that way you don't miss a word. So the third and final fact of the Bible is this: the first English translations of the Bible were illegal. Sort of. It's a bit complicated, but they definitely weren't welcome with open arms. You see, for a really long time, the Catholic Church was using a Bible translation called the Latin Vulgate, which was a Latin translation taken directly from the Hebrew and Greek texts of the Old Testaments. There came a time, though, when people wanted to translate it into English. And although there are many people who contributed English translations of the Bible over time, the 2 pioneers that are most often talked about are John Wycliffe and William Tyndale. John Wycliffe was the first to translate the entire Bible into English in the latter part of the 1300s. His goal was to translate it into English so everybody would be able to read the Bible for themselves. But this was a big deal at the time because the Catholic Church didn't authorize the translation. And they also believed that Wycliffe's translation was being created with the specific intention of attacking the Catholic Church. So they declared Wycliffe a heretic, excommunicated him from the church, banned his writings, and burned the remains of his dead body. Now, to be fair, the church did do all of that after Wycliffe was already dead, but still, that's a little bit overkill. Yes, pun intended. But hundreds of years later, William Tyndale wasn't so lucky. Tyndale was actually burned alive in 1536 for defying King Henry VIII's orders and transcribing the first English translation directly from the original Hebrew and Greek languages. Although Wycliffe deserves credit for translating the English Bible from the Latin Vulgate that the Catholic Church was using at the time, Tyndale went even further and translated his English Bible directly from the original Hebrew and Greek languages. Not only that, but Tyndale was also the first to use the printing press to make copies of his new English Bible at a much faster pace than ever produced before. But because Tyndale defied the king's orders and allegedly had more personal issues with the king that were unrelated, Tyndale was strangled and burned alive. Now there's a lot more historical nuance to what I just said here, and I didn't even scratch the surface of what happened back then. So I do encourage you to do your own research about what happened to John Wycliffe and William Tyndale so that way you can get a fair perspective on both sides. But the bottom line is this: people sacrificed everything, some people even their own lives, to make the Bible available to you today. The same Bible that you read every day, or that may even be catching dust in the back of your room on the shelf, A lot of people fought really hard for you to have that. And even Christ himself said that that same Bible was going to be made available to you and the rest of the world one day. And that's something worth thinking about. So even if you haven't read it yet, maybe now is finally the time for you to open up your Bible and see what's inside. It may actually change the course of your entire life. But if these facts weren't enough to convince you, or if you just want to learn more about the Bible, then make sure to click this video right here, subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you in the next one. God bless.